When people ask me what I like about music, I think about Beethoven, and the answer is motivic transformation. I love the way that Beethoven takes a motive and develops it. When I think about other kinds of music, I come up with a different answer. When I was young, there used to be something called AM radio. I know it's hard to believe, but it was ubiquitous. Older people had AM radios in their homes, and they were on all the time. Younger people actually had AM radios built into their automobiles, and they were on all the time. These radios played the same 40 songs, the so-called top 40, over and over and over. Many of these songs I despised, but a few of them I actually liked. As I became a more knowledgeable musician, I became curious as to why I liked some of these songs better than others. It turns out that some of the songs, like the classic Beatles songs, I liked for the same reasons that I liked classical music. They may not have had sophisticated motivic transformations, but they did have interesting chord progressions, dramatic changes of texture, colorful orchestrations. And then there were the songs that didn't. Some of these songs were so cliched, so simplistic, so poorly performed that they seemed to have no redeeming value whatsoever. And yet, I actually like some of these songs. I ask myself, why? The answer I came up with was that I just liked the basic sound of the song. They were like cheap candy. They were made from inferior materials, but I still liked the basic flavor of those materials. The basic material of melody is mode. Each mode has its own special flavor, its own characteristic sound. There is a myth that is perpetrated on poor unsuspecting music theory students that there are really only two modes, major and minor. Like all myths, it serves a purpose. It serves as a simplification. It's a lot simpler to teach two modes than 7, or 9, or 1330, as are found in Nicholas Slanimsky's Thesaurus of Musical Scales. While the simplification argument does provide the teacher some defense from criticism, the students often complain that in today's music more than two modes are used. The teacher can counter with the common practice argument. The common practice argument states that there was a period of time from about 1600 to 1900 that we call the common practice period, and that during this period only two modes were used. The music of this period provides the basis for today's music. This argument is sometimes but not always persuasive. It ignores the fact that there was music before the common practice period that might also be a basis for today's music. It ignores the fact that the end of the common practice period was actually a long time ago. When I was young, 50 or 60 years ago, 1900 seemed a lot closer than it does today. Back in those days, there was the argument that modern music was a kind of a recent aberration, and that eventually people would come to their senses and go back to common practice norms. At this point, I don't see that happening. There was also the argument that music written since 1900 was somehow inferior. Students find this insulting and condescending. They have no problem rejecting it. As I read more music theory texts written during the common practice period, I came to realize that modal music was not unknown during that time. Modal music was still being taught, and sometimes modes were still being used. Modes are often taught in terms of relative scales. Relative scales have the same collection of pitches, but different starting notes. For example, C major and A minor are both made up of the white notes of the piano, but they have different tonics. It's possible to learn the names of the modes based upon their positions, and to learn to construct the modes based upon their patterns of half steps and whole steps. Thinking of the modes in this way emphasizes their similarities, that they're all made up of the same notes. But we shouldn't be emphasizing their similarities. We should be interested in their differences. What we want to know is, why does each mode sound the way it does? Why does it have its own characteristic flavor? The best way to do this is to compare each mode to the familiar sound of major or minor. After first describing modes in terms of relatives, A.B. Marx explained that the sound of the mode was based on the third being either major or minor, and on certain other pitches that deviate from the standard major or minor scales. He wrote, "Those tones are essential, which distinguish one key from another. It is natural that we begin with those keys which resemble each other. Which tones are now essential to and characteristic of the Mixolydian? 1. The third, for it stamps the key major. 2. The minor seventh, for it distinguishes it from the Ionian, by which marks means major. He goes on. Which are the characteristic tones of the Dorian? 1. The third, because it stamps the key minor. 2. The major sixth, for it distinguishes this key from the Aeolian, by which he means natural minor. Let me quickly run you through the 7 diatonic modes. Ionian is just another term for standard major. Mixolydian is major with the 7th lowered by a half step. Lydian is major with the 4th raised by a half step. Aeolian is just natural minor. Dorian is natural minor with the 6th raised by a half step. Phrygian is natural minor with the 2nd lowered by a half step. Locrian is natural minor with the 2nd and the 5th both lowered by half steps. Let me play these for you really quickly. Major, Ionian. Minor, Aeolian. Dorian. Let me stop right there. After all this talk about how different the modes sound, I'm not really hearing much. I can hear the difference between major and minor, I guess, fairly easily. But when it comes to natural minor and Dorian, it's tough. I have to count to 6, and then I have to try to determine whether the 6th is raised or lowered. In order to emphasize the differences between the modes, it's necessary to put each in a context that emphasizes those pitches which are characteristic of the mode. Let's start out with a familiar melody, the first phrase of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Here it is in major. Notice how different it sounds in natural minor, with the 3rd and 6th lowered. The next example is in Phrygian. Notice how it sounds just like minor until the end, when the lowered 2nd lends it that characteristic Phrygian sound. Here's Twinkle in Dorian. This doesn't have the characteristic Dorian sound. The first half of the phrase sounds just like the original major version, the second half like the minor version. In order for the Dorian sound of the melody to shine through, the characteristic alteration of Dorian compared to natural minor, its raised 6th, needs to be made evident within the context of the Dorian mode. This is not happening at the beginning because the beginning of the tune in Dorian is just like it is in major. Altering one note in the 2nd measure turns the upward leap of a 5th into a minor arpeggio, thus establishing the minor sound. This makes the melody sound characteristically Dorian. Since Locrian has a lowered 5th, simply mapping the Locrian accidentals onto the melody makes it sound characteristically Locrian. Let me play the major version again to get it back in your ear. Since there are no 7th scale degrees in the melody, and the only difference between major and Mixolydian is the 7th scale degree, the 7th scale degree will need to be added to the Twinkle melody in order to make it sound characteristically Mixolydian. When designing a Lydian version of the tune, I ran into the problem of not emphasizing the characteristic raised 4th enough. I borrowed the arpeggio idea from our Dorian example so that I could emphasize the relationship of the raised 4th with the 6th scale degree, and I added a raised 4th to the penultimate measure to lend a Lydian feel to the cadence. Cadences can be tricky in Lydian. Since Lydian contains a leading tone, it's easy to use that leading tone to create conventional cadences, just like in major. But if you do that, the mode tends to lose its character. It ends up sounding too much like regular major. By adding the last F sharp, I've tried to emphasize the relationship of the F sharp to the D to create a cadence that approaches the tonic from above rather than below. This kind of cadence has a more Lydian sound. Just for fun, let's use some more exotic modes. Here's an example in whole tone. This mode has 6 notes, all a whole step apart. How about a blues version? A blues scale has a gap of a minor third between the 5th and the 7th, and a gap of a minor third between tonic and the median. This means that the A's in the tune become B flats, and the D's in the penultimate measure become E flats. The blues scale also has consecutive half steps in the middle. These appear in our example in the descending scale. Let's do one more, based on an octatonic scale. This is an 8-note scale consisting of alternating half steps and whole steps. This alteration works well in the descending part of the tune. The idea that common practice composers only knew 2 modes is disproved not only by the A.B. Marx book, but also by the Gottfried Weber book from the early 19th century and from the writings of Georg Vogler and Johann Kernberger and J.J. Fuchs. Fuchs's book, Gradus ad Parnassum, is probably the most commonly used music textbook of all time. We know that many of the great composers from the 18th and 19th centuries learned from it. It includes exercises in 6 of the 7 modes. So, if composers in the common practice period knew how to write in 6 different modes, why didn't they? I think it's because they just liked the way that major and minor sounded. Major and minor are relatively recent inventions, having developed at the end of the Renaissance. The craze for writing in major and minor lasted for centuries, but that doesn't mean that other modes were never used. For example, the second movement of the first Brandenburg Concerto by Bach is in the Phrygian mode. Here's an excerpt from that movement. Notice that the excerpt begins in A Phrygian, modulates to D Phrygian, and then modulates back to A Phrygian at the end. Notice that the cadence at the end descends by a half step to tonic, a typical Phrygian cadence. Here's a classical period example by Georg Vogler of the use of another mode, pentatonic. Pentatonic is another gap scale. It contains two minor third gaps with whole steps between them. It is often thought of in physical terms, represented by the black keys of the piano. Notice the minor third gaps from E flat to G flat and B flat to D flat. It's easy to transpose this to any tonic as long as the minor third gaps are maintained. Here's an example from the Romantic period, a Lydian melody from a Chopin mazurka. So far, we've talked about isolated examples of modality in 18th and 19th century music. As the 19th century wore on, modality became more commonplace. We'll talk about that next time.